So his name is Homer Simpson. And he lives on Evergreen Terrace. He works at a nuclear power plant. And in 1996, the Christian Century magazine named Homer and the entire Simpson family as America's most religious TV family. They pray. They turn to God often when times are tough. And they go to church most of the time. Until one day, Homer decides that he's not going to go to church anymore. He's having one of the worst mornings of his life. His pants have torn, his cereal has been drenched in milk, and the car will not start. And he cannot stomach one more boring sermon from Reverend Lovejoy. I know you can all relate to that. So he decides to stay home from church and to start his own religion, which consists of watching football, peeing with the bathroom door open, making his famous moon waffles, and smoking cigars on the couch, which he is doing one Sunday morning when he falls asleep, starting a fire that rages through the Simpson home. Completely oblivious to his precarious situation, Homer is ultimately saved by his neighbor, Ned Flanders, who is an evangelical Christian and the bane of Homer's existence, as well as the Springfield Volunteer Fire Department, which has in it Krusty the Clown, who is a practicing Jew, and Apu, who is a worshiping Hindu. Saved and safe and the fire extinguished, Homer sits in his family's kitchen around the table, surrounded by family and friends and Reverend Lovejoy. And when Reverend Lovejoy asks Homer if he had learned a lesson from his attempt to start his own religion and from the fire, Homer opines, "Yes, God is an angry God, a vengeful God." And dropping to his knees, he lets out a powerful prayer which begins with the exhortation, "O smiteful one." But Reverend Lovejoy was in church last Sunday, so he heard that God does not use the agents of chaos to teach us lessons in life. So he counters. He was in church last Sunday. So he counters that in his most sincere pastoral moment in the history of the show, Reverend Lovejoy is a horrible pastor, but this moment he actually gets it right. And he says to Homer, "No, Homer, God did not start the fire, but God was working in the hearts of your friends, be they Jew, Christian, or miscellaneous." Which Apu says, "Hindu, there are 2 billion of us." Her name is Naomi, and she was 15 years old when Poland was simultaneously invaded by Nazi Germany and the former Soviet Union. And like so many Jews living in Poland in 1939, she was first relocated from her small village to a ghetto in an urban Polish city, and then to the work camp of Buchenau, which is the sister camp to the much more famous Auschwitz. It was when she arrived at the camp that she was separated from her father and mother and baby sister. She later learned that her brother survived, but she lost her father and mother and little sister to the Holocaust. For 5 years, she labored in a textile mill that made garments for the Nazi Navy. And her days were excruciating, things that most of us here cannot imagine. In her presentation that she gave at Flathead High School in Kalispell, Montana, to a packed auditorium of 50 students and adults, Naomi confessed that there is only one reason why she made it through the Holocaust, and that was the woman named Martha. Martha was already a prisoner at Buchenau when Naomi was transitioned there. And in the inversion of the very beautiful biblical story of Ruth, Martha adopts Naomi instead of Naomi adopting Ruth. And Martha was a mother to Naomi. Martha was a German Lutheran from a very small village in northern Germany. Her husband was a Lutheran minister, and Martha and her husband courageously sheltered and housed Jewish families as they in a German version of the Underground Railroad, assisting Jewish families as they were going north out of Germany into Denmark and then just away, just anywhere, away. Martha shared a portion of her meal every single day with Naomi. Every day, without fail, a portion of Martha's gruel or soup or on special occasions bread she shared with Naomi. And in the worst week of Naomi's life, in an endless cycle of horrible, nightmarish days, Martha died. A nasty Polish winter brought a tsunami of sleet and rain breaking through the roof of the women's barrack. There were bars on the window, and the front door of the barrack had this unbreakable lock on it. And so the women were trapped inside of the barrack, and they froze, and the barrack was flooded with sleet and rain. And Martha, already weak, contracted pneumonia and never recovered. Whenever Naomi protested to Martha that she take all of her food, Martha would snap at Naomi, "Du lebst," you live. "Du liebst," you love. And do you notice how those words in both German and English, love and live, are only separated by one single vowel? Naomi honors Martha's sacrifice daily by lifting up the mourner's Kaddish, a Jewish prayer of grief and remembrance, and by sharing the story of Martha with anyone who has ears to hear. For as long as we live, they too shall live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. His name is Roger Painter. Roger was nearing retirement after decades in the ministry. He and his spouse had bought a little land and a lovely, charming two-story cottage outside of Austin in the little town of Onion Creek. Their retirement home was set right there on the river, and it was lovely. They couldn't see their closest neighbor from their front porch. That sounds heavenly to me. It was so quiet, so secluded. And on one week, Reverend Painter, senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, decided to steal a few days away in the cabin in Onion Creek while his wife stayed back in Austin. "See you on Thursday," Roger said to her. "God willing and the creek don't rise," she replied back. Well, sisters and brothers, two things can be true at the same time. God can will, and the creek can rise. And suddenly, while Roger was at his cabin, his cottage in Onion Creek, a violent Texas summer storm ripped through central Texas, and Roger Payne fell asleep in the upstairs bedroom to the melodious sounds of rain hitting his window and thunder rolling like thunder. And while he slept, the water crested and came rushing into his first floor. "How high is the water, Mama?" Johnny Cash once sang. 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot and rising. And poor Roger was a poor swimmer, slightly obese with a bad hip. He was in a tight spot. And then he heard banging on the front door, and he yelled as loud as he could. And the door gave way like a ship run aground, and in waded Jorge and Stefan, the painter's neighbors, though neither Roger nor his spouse had ever seen them before. Jorge and Stefan were driving the road that ran parallel to the creek, making sure that their neighbors were safe. And they came into the house, brought Roger down the stairs, and guided Roger safely out of the house into their car, back to their home, where they gave him a blanket and sat him next to the stove and gave him a cup of hot cocoa. And when Roger had become more of himself again, the neighbors who had been strangers to him just hours before, they got to know each other. Jorge and Stefan had lived in Onion Creek for 5 years. They owned and ran a store down on Main Street. They had come to Onion Creek when Jorge had lost his job because he had been outed as a homosexual in 1983. The firing also meant that they got outed at their church, which turned on them, asking them to leave. And when it was Roger's turn to share that he was the senior minister at First Baptist Church in Austin, Jorge and Stefan physically distanced themselves in a self-preservation tactic for what they assumed would be a few Bibles being thrown at them. Probably figuratively, but one never knows when it comes to a religious bigot. The next Sunday, Reverend Dr. Roger Painter stood in the pulpit of First Baptist Church, Austin, Texas, and shared this story with his congregation, asking them the question, what does the Lord God require of you? To love justice, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. And First Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, in 1988, began a journey to become an open and affirming congregation years before that journey even had a name, due to the extraordinary love of neighbors and the courage of these two men that had been pushed to the margins by society. And when the Painters returned to Onion Creek, they made a point to get to know and to come to love their neighbors, Jorge and Stefan. His name is Saul of Tarsus. He's a criminal, imprisoned 3 times. He's shipwrecked. He doesn't have the best of luck. And Saul of Tarsus must rely solely on the kindness of strangers. Indeed, he even has to put his trust in a man whose very job is to persecute Christians, the centurion. And when the waves come crashing down and his life becomes the splinters of a run-aground ship, Paul was ministered back to health and wholeness by the Maltons. I don't know the timeline. When did Saul of Tarsus write his letter to the churches in Corinth? In correlation to being imprisoned and shipwrecked and then cared for by the centurion, and in being shipwrecked and surviving due to the camaraderie of those who were tossed to the sea and the ministry of hospitality by the indigenous people of Malta. I don't know which one came first, but I like to think that Saul wrote the letter to the Corinth churches about their pettiness and their corruption, wrecking those congregations, and when he penned his hymn to love in that letter, that he had the very experience of this shipwreck and being brought back to health by the Maltons foremost in his mind and foremost on his heart. For Paul did boast that he conversed with God. And he did speak in tongues with angels. And he did prophesy the weather. And let's face it, Paul was never shy about sharing what the correct doctrine of the Christian faith was. But none of those things matter. All of those things will fade away. Prophesying, tongue speaking, boasting about proper doctrine, all of those things do not matter. Not like love does. Kind and patient love, the type of love that kindles hope and faith. We're not sheltered from the vulnerabilities of life. Even in our mostly normal lives, we come across the breadth and depth of human experience that can wreck us to our core. Perhaps that's how we live through our journey of our lives and speak the loudest about who we are and what we believe and how we travel, is how we show love and kindness and patience. There are terrors in the night, sisters and brothers, cruelties of this loud and rude and confusing world. But a little love and patience and kindness goes a long way to helping us get through it. We have no idea when the fires will start, when the waves will rage, when the flood will overtake us. They come unexpectedly in the night. But the best laid plans can be whisked away by the fires and the waves. but we can be a life raft, a safe harbor, a place for folks who are going through the storms, just like people have done that for us. Take 2 seconds, think of someone in your mind's eye and in your heart who has been a safe harbor for you. Now, it doesn't take another 2 seconds for you to lift that person up in prayer of gratitude and thanksgiving to our life-giving, sustaining, nurturing God. Lifting up a prayer for the Maltons in your life who cared for you and nursed you back to health when you washed up on their shore unexpectedly. We Christians, we spend way too much time on miracles and doctrine, who can serve communion, whether or not a person should be like in a robe with a stole or a dope t-shirt. We focus so much stuff on that stuff in scriptures, and we parse it out, and we dive into the weeds, which is fun. But we miss so much more of the aspects of the hand of God and gestures of courage and kindness through the actions of everyday human beings. Women and men who could fall into the sinfulness of apathy or stinginess, but instead allow themselves to be utilized for the furthering of God's peaceable reign on earth as it is in heaven, regardless of whether they are Jew, Christian, or miscellaneous, or gay, or straight, or young, or old, in a confined space of immense oppression, or whether or not they unexpectedly, out of nowhere, washed up on our shore. His name is your name. Her name is your name. Paul had a repentant experience on the road to Damascus, but his conversion to a Christ-like life took a lifetime. It was honed moment by moment, day by day, living out the Christian life of love, kindness, patience, doing justice, and walking humbly. It is not a once and for all thing like an epiphany on the road or lifting up a prophecy about the weather at sea. Those things pass away. They don't matter. But love, kindness, compassion, courage, they stay with us. They linger. They change us. They inspire us. And that, sisters and brothers, cannot be better good news for us today. Amen? Amen. And amen.